is Jamie Myra. I'm the Executive Director of PHA Canada. I've had the pleasure and the honor of working with the PH community now for over 8 years, and I'm very, very glad to welcome you to our national conference and to Calgary. I'm very happy to be with you here today. Oh, thank you. First, I would like to start by acknowledging that PHA Canada conducts our operations across the vast and diverse lands that we now call Canada. These lands are home to the traditional territories of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, each with their own distinct cultures, languages, and histories. Today, we are meeting on the traditional territories of the peoples of Treaty 7, including the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, the Piikani, the Bearspaw, and the Good Stoney First Nations. Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, District 5 and 6. At PHA Canada, our team aims to be mindful of their unique rights and perspectives, to actively seek engagement and partnership, and to strive to work together to build sustainable relationships. Our vision of a more inclusive and equitable future guides us in providing caring, reliable, and high-quality services, and honoring the contributions of Indigenous cultures to Canada's tapestry. I hope that today you will take a moment to appreciate that we are here in lands that have been cared for and protected by Indigenous people for thousands of years, and I just thank them for having us. I want to thank you for attending this year's community conference. There are nearly 300 people registered from across the country, with over 200 of you planning to be here today in Calgary, and many, many more online. So hello and welcome to all of our online recipients across the country. I know it's not nearly as fun to attend an event like this from your home, but we really appreciate you also taking the time to be with us. I hope you were able to join us for last night's very special welcome reception, where we honored a very special leader, Jazz James from Vancouver Island. Thank you, Jazz, for being a good sport and allowing us to celebrate you and share our deep appreciation for all the support that you give to all of us. I think last night was also a really wonderful reflection of this year's conference theme, diverse voices, shared experience. In a room full of people, everyone I met had a different story. And looking around, it might be easy to assume that you maybe don't share much in common with a lot of the people in this room. But I promise you that today you are with family, not with not with an F, of course, but with a PH. And in this space, you are surrounded by people who just get it. And while we may not always agree on everything, just like family, I promise you that we are here for you, and that the people in this room will be here for you for the good stuff and the hard stuff, because in this family, no one fights alone. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Lisa Melnichuk. Lisa is perhaps best known as a PH specialist in Ottawa and the chair of PHA Canada for the past year. However, Lisa's compassion and expertise were needed elsewhere, and we have reluctantly agreed to loan her to the US for a little while. Thankfully, her commitment to the Canadian PH community has not wavered at all, and we look forward to continuing to work with her on the board of directors and as a valuable partner in research and advocacy. But first, I really want to take this opportunity to thank her for her service to the community and her leadership to the board for the last year as chair.
Thank you very much. I'm going to be very brief. I just want to say welcome. I want to say welcome to everybody in the room. It is just fantastic to be here. I look forward to this every year, and I know many people around the room and online do as well. Although this is the first day of our meeting, as you know, we've been rolling for a few days now. There's been some really fantastic things that have happened here in this hotel in the last couple of days. We know our CPHN group has met a couple of times. We've had a CAFNet meeting. For those that don't know, that's a meeting of interested patients and scientists to talk about database and research priorities. And most, I think, excitingly, we've spent the last 2 days with our PH think tank. This has been spearheaded and led by John Granton and colleagues on the planning committee. And over the last 2 days, it's been wonderful. We've had discussions about new pathways of disease, new ways of understanding the pathways we have, potential new treatments, and new ways that we approach the disease together, not just as healthcare professionals, but as healthcare professionals working with our community, you. And it's just been really, really great so far. So all of that to say, I'm most excited about today. I think today is the cream of the cake for the last few days. And if you've seen the program, we have some really exciting things planned today. We have our opening plenary, which we're going to start in just a minute. We have amazing workshops, and I encourage all of you to, choose the ones that interest you. But also, I think one of the most special things about being here today is that we're here together. So, tap someone on the shoulders, talk to us, ask us questions. We're really excited to be here and to partner with you and learn from you as well. So thank you so much for giving us your time. Thank you for coming, and please do reach out to us throughout the day. And just a very special thank you before I go on to Jamie, to Kim, and to all of PHA Canada for helping to get all of these people in the room together. So with that, I will pass it back on to Jamie, and I'll look forward to spending time with everyone today. Thank you.
All right. Like Lisa said, we have a really diverse and engaging program for you today that has been designed so that no matter where you are in your PH journey, there should be something for you. This includes some of our most popular sessions like Mythbusters, questions and answers with PH medical experts, and of course our opening plenary on the future of PH care and treatment, as well as new topics this year, such as navigating relationships, exercise rehabilitation, and how to build successful partnerships between patients and researchers. So now I want to take this opportunity to thank the volunteers who've been instrumental in putting this event together, the PH Medical Think Tank Programs Committee, led by Dr. John Granton, and of course, the Symposium Program Committee, who put together this program you're about to enjoy today. All of their names are in your program. I'm not going to take time to read them out loud, but I hope that if you know one of them, you take a chance to thank them, because they've been spending months and months volunteering to put today together for you. I also want to thank all of you who have volunteered to help us out today at the registration table, at the information table, at the swag booth, in the sessions. This day runs because of the hard work of countless people, so thank you so much to all of you who are contributing. I also really want to thank our speakers. They are all volunteering to be here today to share their time and expertise. Many of the speakers are PH caregivers and patients, and hearing directly from them about their experiences, their perspectives, their needs and dreams is really central to what we do here at PHA Canada. I want to encourage you to be open, to be gracious as we learn from one another, but also to recognize that experiencing these stories can be difficult, both for the storyteller and for the listener. So please know that we are here to support you, and if you need some quiet time or a break during the day, we hope that you will do what you need to take care of yourself. I also want to acknowledge and thank our sponsors who make this event possible. First, this year's platinum sponsor, Merck, our gold sponsor, Janssen, our bronze sponsors, Gossamer Bio, McKesson Canada, and United Therapeutics, and our supporter this year, Shoppers Specialty Health Network. Please give them all a round of applause. Many of the representatives are here in the room today. They have given us tremendous support. As you heard from Lisa, we've also been meeting for the last 2 days for our think tank, and I also thank platinum sponsor Merck, gold sponsor Janssen, silver sponsor Shoppers, bronze sponsors Gossamer Bio and United Therapeutics, and supporter Bear for their support for that meeting as well. And Lisa already mentioned it, but I also want to take the opportunity to thank the staff team for their incredible work these past months. Sorry, I'm going to go. For those who don't know, I've had to take a brief medical leave this summer. I was off for a few weeks, but I was really only able to do that because of the knowledge and confidence that I had that no detail would get past this team, that they would do everything that they needed to be prepared to provide you with a really amazing experience, even if I couldn't be here. I'm so glad that I am, but I'm so grateful to them for all of their work. So a huge thank you to Kim, Elgin, Jeremy, Robin, and Ethel, who has also really worked hard and is back in Vancouver. So thank you very much to all of them. And with that, actually, sorry, I almost forgot something. I also just wanted to remind everybody that we have some special people with us in the reception area. So we have guests from Caregivers of Alberta with us. There are a couple of caregiving coaches that are here. So if any of you would like an opportunity to go and speak with them, they have a table just sort of on your way to the washrooms. There are also similar sister organizations in other provinces. So even if you're not from Alberta, by all means, please go and stop by and check out their resources. And then also reminder that our ambassadors are here. They have a space out in the reception area as well. They're also wearing t-shirts that say, "I'll be here for you." And I think they have a special tag on their name tags as well. So if you're interested in finding out more about what they do, or just looking for a friendly face if you're new, then I really encourage you to reach out to the ambassador team as well. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Lisa, who's going to get us ready for our opening plenary.
Wonderful. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first opening plenary, which I think is going to be a lot of fun and we hope a lot of interesting discussion. Maybe what I'll do first is before we start though, there's something very important that I think that we do every year at this meeting, and that's to take a minute to acknowledge those in our lives that have passed in the last year. These people are our family, our friends, our colleagues, and our patients. And I just think it would be a nice way to start if we could just take 1 minute in silence to remember those people in our hearts. Thank you very much. With that, I will take the prerogative and the pleasure to introduce my two co-chairs for this symposium, and I'm wondering if they might want to come up to the nice comfy chairs here. What we're going to do today is, it gives me great pleasure first to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Jason Weatherald. Jason needs no introduction. He is a respirologist at the University of Alberta and a key opinion leader and thought leader in research around pulmonary hypertension. Jason is leading a large number of studies as it relates to the management and the discovery of therapeutics around patients who have PAH and different types of pulmonary hypertension as well. And so Jason is going to talk to us about new and emerging therapies and ways of understanding and learning about this disease. And then also this morning, we're going to hear from Dr. Sanjay Mehta. Dr. Sanjay Mehta, a founding father of PHA Canada, a leader, someone who's influenced all of our lives in many different ways, both directly and indirectly, through his experiences in education and knowledge around pulmonary hypertension. And so Dr. Mehta and I are going to sit up here in these comfy chairs with Jason, and we're just going to have a conversation about PAH and treatments and what's on the horizon. So we're going to have a little discussion with Jason and then some roundtable conversation. So please feel free to ask us any questions. There's nothing you can't ask us, and we'll do our best to give you an answer. So with that, thanks so much, and I'll invite Jason and Sanjay up here with me.
I guess I'll start up here. Pardon? Yeah, sure.
Good morning, everyone. As Lisa mentioned, we have three fabulous PAH doctors here with us on on the panel to discuss our opening plenary, which was talking about bench to bedside. I'd like to introduce myself to you. Excuse me. First of all, I'd like to welcome all of you to the 2024 PHA Canada Community Conference. We all are so glad that you're here. My name is Joan Paulin, and I'm the current board chair at PHA Canada. For those of you who don't know who I am the mom, and I used to say caregiver, but I now say I'm the emotional support person to my daughter Brooke, who was diagnosed with severe Group 1 PAH in 2014 at the age of 24. I am really excited to be moderating this session. Normally, we close out our conference by asking our doctors and our researchers to peer into their crystal balls and tell us what they think the future of PH looks like. This year, we thought we would like to lead with that discussion because so much of what we do and have done at PHA Canada over the past 2 years has been focused on meeting that future head on, and it's closer than you think. And I'll start with the session title, Bench to Bedside. It's a phrase that speaks to the journey of all new drugs and therapies. It starts with a researcher at a bench wanting to investigate an idea that might improve the lives of patients living with a disease. It moves through a clinical trial process that makes sure the drug does what it was designed to do. And if it does, it then moves through a regulatory process that approves that drug for sale. And finally, it reaches the patient, for who will benefit from the drug at his or her bedside. So from bench, the researcher, to bedside, the patient. When we first introduced the concept of bench to bedside during our ambassador training, we asked participants, where in the drug development journey do you think the patient needs to be involved? Most of you, like them, will probably answer at the drug approval stage, where we need patients to help advocate for access, or perhaps at the bedside stage, where patients actually have access to the new drug. But the answer is actually so much earlier than that. That answer is the reason why PHA Canada has been working so hard on building our patient registry, a clinical trials network, and an ambassador program that will spread the importance of patient participation throughout their disease journey. We'll begin the session with a presentation, including a discussion of potential new treatments in the pipeline, and we'll have no crystal ball will be needed. Following that, there will be an opportunity for questions, and if we can't get, as Lisa had mentioned, if we can't get to all of the questions, I encourage each of you and all of you to reach out to staff, our ambassadors, or me, or anybody on the panel at any time during the conference. If we can't answer the question, we'll find someone who can. And I was going to introduce the panel, which was my next step, but Lisa's done that graciously for me. So I will step away, and Jason can start the presentation. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you again to everyone for coming and for inviting me to speak with you today. Thank you to the sponsors and to PHA Canada. It's really been an honor and a pleasure to work so closely with everyone at this great organization. And I'm obviously very passionate about it, and I'm very excited to share with you what's coming down the pipeline and what do we expect to see in the near future. So the objectives of my talk are up there, but I want to start by helping everyone understand how a clinical trial works. And what does that mean? And I'll try to highlight some of the bench to bedside concepts that Joan has introduced. I want to discuss some of the recent clinical trials that have completed in pulmonary arterial hypertension, and also talk about some of the ongoing studies that are getting into late phase clinical trials in other types of PH. So just to start, what are clinical trials? So clinical trials are a specific type of research involving one or more participants. We're testing an intervention, but that can be a drug, a device, a strategy, a behavioral intervention. And we want to look at whether or not that intervention changes an outcome of interest. That may be some sort of health state. So basically, it involves a population of people. This could be people with pH or people with a genetic risk factor for a disease. And we want to assign them to either a treatment that we're interested in and some kind of control, like a placebo or standard of care. Then you have to follow those people up over time, and you have to measure something. We call these outcomes or endpoints. And then you want to analyze your data and find out, does it work? This graphic here shows what Joan was talking about. This is really the bench to bedside pipeline. So this all starts in the lab. This is exploratory research. And this involves cells and tissues that patients and participants have donated. And researchers try to find out, what are the potential things we could do? How can we develop new targets for drugs? And that takes years. And eventually this goes into what we call preclinical research in animals. And we have experimental models in pigs, rats, sheep, to try to mimic pulmonary hypertension and look at whether or not a new potential therapy might work before it ever touches a human being. Then we do phase 1 trials. So this is to answer the question, is this medication safe? What are the potential doses that might be looked at? And often it starts out in healthy volunteers, just to look at how a drug behaves in the body and how the levels in the blood behave over time. And then we start looking at people with the disease of interest, and this is usually in a phase 2 study. So this is a smaller group of people in which we're trying to ask, is this drug safe, and does it do what we think it does? After a phase 2 trial, then you can do a phase 3 trial. This is what is necessary for the approval of a new treatment, and this is in a larger group of people with a condition of interest, and we want to know, first and foremost, is it safe, and does it work in the population of interest? But it doesn't start there, because clinical trials are a very select group of people. There's inclusion criteria, and there's some exclusion criteria, because people that develop drugs and new treatments want to optimize the chances of finding a correct result. But that means that the results may not be generalizable to everybody with the condition. So after a new treatment is approved, we do what are called phase 4 studies, and that's where we're looking at a more broad group of people with different conditions. We're looking for safety, rare side effects that might not show up in a study of a small number of people. Why does this process take so long? So this is a graphic from Australia. It's looking at cancer drugs, but you can see that discovery work takes time. People need to get money to do the research. They have to have an idea. They have to have preliminary data. And then they have to do the experiments and show that something might work. And only then do they take it into animals. And then there's a long process to even get a clinical trial up and running to look at a potential treatment in human beings. So that's why this takes years to go from clinical, from the bench to the bedside into patients. And then we do need to do this post-marketing follow-up to look for rare adverse events. And so this timeline shows cancer drugs, but when you think about rare diseases, it can take even longer. First of all, there's maybe less interest by the funding bodies. There's not as many people that can participate in these trials, so they can take even longer. So this is why it takes, a decade or more to go from an idea to a new treatment. Why do we need clinical trials? So there are different types of research, but a randomized controlled clinical trial is the most rigorous way to answer the question, does something work in medicine? And so the next few slides, I want to try to teach you a little bit about what we look at and what is important in a clinical trial to make sure that we can trust those results, okay? Really what we're trying to do in a clinical trial is answer the question, is a treatment safe? Is it effective? We want to advance knowledge so we can find out who benefits from a treatment. These are the key features that are needed in a phase 3 trial. Again, these are the types of trials that are needed in order to get a new treatment to market. So when you're looking on the internet or you read a news story about, new potential treatment might cure cancer, you can look at where does that research come from? What is the quality of that research? Often when you look really closely, it's not true. It's, they found a molecule that worked in animals. They haven't actually tested it properly in humans. And a trial needs to have these features in order to be reliable and to eliminate potential bias. So the first component is something called randomization. So randomization means you go into a trial and there's a chance that you get the new treatment or you don't get the other treatment. This is absolutely essential to make sure that two groups of people are completely the same with respect to every other thing except for the treatment of interest. So that's a bit of a complicated thing, but it's really important. It makes sure that we know that the reason for the result is only the treatment. It's not due to other things that we call confounders. We also need a control. So you can't just look at a treatment in a group of people and say that it works, because you don't know what would have happened if they didn't get the treatment at all. So you need some group of participants to compare this intervention to. And ideally, we have something called blinding. This means that the participant and the clinician don't know what you're getting. Why is that important? Well, we're all human beings, and we have our own biases, and we may report things different. The doctors may do things a little bit different if they know what you're taking, and that depends on your beliefs about whether or not something will work or won't work. So we need to make sure that people don't behave differently between the standard of care placebo arm and the active treatment group in a trial. So this is not always possible. There are types of interventions like a surgery where you can't really do fake surgery on somebody. So it's not always possible, but we try to minimize these potential biases in trials whenever possible. The other thing that's important, if you've ever participated in a clinical trial, is making sure that we follow people up to the end of the study. There's a lot of reasons why people drop out of clinical trials, but when this happens a lot in a clinical trial, it can actually undermine the results. Sometimes the reason why people discontinue a trial is because the drug has toxic side effects. And if we don't know about that, we may underreport it. So what are we measuring in phase 3 clinical trials and even early phase clinical trials in PH? So in those early phase 1 studies, we just want to know, how does this drug work in the body? Is it safe, or are there any major red flags? These are small trials often done in 10, 20, 30 patients. Then it can go on to a phase 2 trial. And as I mentioned before, we want to look, is this safe? Can it potentially do what we think it does? And the way we measure that in phase 2 studies is usually with a right heart catheterization. We want to know, does this affect the pressure and flow of blood in the lungs? If it's promising in phase 2, we go on to phase 3 trials. And this is from the US, but I think it's a good way to summarize what you need to look at in a phase 3 trial. You need to show that an intervention affects how someone feels, functions, or survives. So the measurements that we're looking at in a trial has to be one of those things in order to get a treatment approved. That could be symptoms. Functions can be a variety of things. In PH, it's usually the 6-minute walking distance, because that's a valid measure of how you function. But also survive. Some of the trials that we've had have actually looked at not just length of life, but do people end up in hospital? Do they get worse? And we call those endpoint-driven trials. So let's get on to the exciting part. Now that we all understand how clinical trials work, what's on the horizon? So lots of our existing therapies have to do with vasodilation. So in PH, part of the problem is that blood vessels constrict. Now they also get thickened and remodeled, but we can develop drugs that dilate blood vessels, and that makes it easier for blood to flow through the lungs. But it's more complicated than that. The arteries in the normal lung are very wide open. They have very thin walls, and in PH, those walls get thick. It makes it harder for blood to flow. And the processes, the biological processes that lead to that include overgrowth of cells, inflammation, we call it remodeling of the blood vessels, and sometimes a loss of blood vessels. So ideally, we would develop treatments that had anti-proliferation effects, anti-inflammation, reverse remodeling, and developed in new blood vessel growth. So these are some of the ways we think about targets that could lead to new treatments. We never want to forget the heart. So in pulmonary hypertension, the right side of the heart is under stress. We could conceive of new treatments that actually target the heart itself, which might make it easier for people to feel better, to function better, and to live longer. This is a really busy slide. This is from a scientific article, but it just shows you the range of things that people are looking at. We're looking at anti-inflammatory therapies. We're looking at hormonal treatments. We're looking at molecules that target the tissues around the blood vessels to see if we can improve the way that the blood vessels function. We've looked at cell-based therapies where people get stem cells either from their own body or from others to try to improve the function of the blood vessels in the lungs. So this just summarizes the many complex pathways that are involved in pulmonary hypertension and how we can develop potential treatments to target these pathways. I want to talk a little bit about sotatercept. As you've probably heard, this is a new potential treatment for pulmonary arterial hypertension. It's been approved now in Canada and hopefully will be available soon. But I wanted to explain a little bit about how it works and what is the actual data that has led to the availability of this new drug. So in PAH, we have kind of a balance of signals, of molecules that tell the blood vessels to overgrow, to become abnormal. And then there's factors in the body that sort of prevent that process. Sotatercept is like an antibody that scavenges these particles that promote the overgrowth of blood vessels. So really what it's doing, it's inhibiting those bad things to try to rebalance pro-proliferation and anti-proliferation in the lung. I have some QR codes there if you want to look into the actual scientific articles that have been published on this topic, as well as a CNN article when it was shown to work in the phase 3 trial. So the big phase 3 trial was called the STELLAR trial. So in this study, they randomly assigned people to get sotatercept, which is given by an injection every 3 weeks, or a placebo, so a saltwater solution that looked, smelled, was exactly like sotatercept, also injected. This was given every 3 weeks, and patients were followed for up to 6 months. And the main results of this trial were that sotatercept improved the 6-minute walking distance by about 40 meters. Now that may not sound like very much, but we know from other studies that anything that can increase it more than 30 to 33 meters is actually clinically meaningful. It's linked to better symptoms, to better outcomes. And so that is not only what we call statistically significant, but clinically meaningful. It also lowered the blood pressure in the lungs. It lowered the NT-proBNP levels. Those are the blood tests that we get to look at the stress on the right side of the heart. It reduced clinical outcomes. They have an outcome that was called time to death or non-fatal clinical worsening. So those are things like hospitalizations, combinations of worsening function on the walk test plus worsening symptoms. And it reduced that by 84% compared to the placebo arm. Really importantly, we always have to talk about safety and adverse events. So the main problem that we saw in this trial, the main side effects that we saw were bleeding episodes. Most of those had to do with nosebleeds, but there have been some serious bleeding events. So I just wanted to highlight the fact that nothing is perfect. This is not a cure, and there are potential adverse effects, but it's a very promising new treatment. So sotatercept is now approved by Health Canada as of a couple of weeks ago. This is the news release from PHA Canada in patients with PAH and functional class 2 and 3 symptoms. So that doesn't mean that we can just get it into patients the next day. I wanted to just give a brief overview of what's the process of getting a new drug in Canada. So first you have to get Health Canada approval. This means that the drug can actually be used in the country. The drug is not already in the country. It takes time for the manufacturer to get the drug shipped to Canada, stored in Canada. You know, it has to be refrigerated. There's quality control that needs to be maintained in order for a drug to remain safe to use in people. It then undergoes a review by something called Canada's Drug Agency and this other organization called PCPA. And this is kind of a complicated process, but it aims to compare a new treatment, any new drug or device treatment, to other treatments in the disease space to look at how much value this treatment actually has and sort of what is the expected improvement for patients. And they try to actually put a dollar amount to that to try to figure out what a certain treatment should cost in a country. And this is different in every country. The UK does this, other European countries do this. But this is really necessary because of the way healthcare is organized in Canada. We don't have a national healthcare system like in the United Kingdom. We have provincial healthcare systems, and each province and even each health region may need to negotiate what price they're willing to pay for any treatment. Only after that's been agreed upon and regions or provinces agree to pay for a new treatment can it be used in the clinics in a publicly reimbursed system. Of course, there are other options. There are compassionate release programs. There are private insurance companies. So there are other ways, but for most provincial public funders in Canada, this is how it works. So as I said, this is a really exciting advance. We're all very excited to have access to this drug eventually, but there are some unanswered questions. There's only been one trial, big trial finished in this disease with this treatment, and we don't have a ton of long-term data yet, so we don't know how enduring is the effect of sotatercept? Do the effects wear off over time? Does it work in newly diagnosed patients? Does it work in very severe patients? The group of population of patients that were in the STELLAR trial had been around for about 7 years. Most of them were fairly stable patients. They were functional class 2 and 3. We don't really know, does this work if you were diagnosed last week? How well does it work in that situation? Does it work in patients who are very severe, who are in hospital in heart failure? They have ongoing trials to try to answer some of these questions, but we don't really know that yet. There's certain subgroups of patients that weren't very common in the trial, and so we don't really know for sure how well it works in those groups of people, like people with scleroderma, people with congenital heart disease. There weren't that many people in there, so we can't make inferences yet about how well it works. We don't know yet whether it works in other types of PH. There is actually a study that's ongoing looking at people with pulmonary hypertension due to heart disease. We'll find out some results from that trial hopefully soon. And one big question that's come up already from patients, and we've heard about this in news releases and Facebook groups, is if you do really well on this drug, can you take away other drugs? Now, next I wanted to talk about another treatment called seralutinib. So this works differently than sotatercept. It's an inhaled molecule. It's like a small molecule that works in a variety of ways on different types of cells in the lung to also potentially reverse that abnormal remodeling, potentially stop that overgrowth of cells. And in animal studies, it seems to do that. This is just some data, you don't need to look at it, but it's just showing that in animals with pulmonary hypertension that's induced experimentally, that this drug, which is inhaled, may actually help reverse aspects of the disease. So seralutinib has completed a phase 2 trial called the TORREY study, and this has been published now, and it does seem to do something in the lungs. Again, it's inhaled, so it's different than an injection or a pill, which has some potential advantages. It does reduce what we call the pulmonary vascular resistance in the lung by 14%. Now, the study wasn't big enough to really look at 6-minute walk distance, but the improvement in function was smaller than in the other study I showed you, so it was only 6.5 meters improvement. Overall, it seemed to be pretty safe. I mean, it's an inhaled drug, and people coughed a little bit with it, but there were not a lot of very severe adverse events in this small study. So again, promising, but we need to look at it in a larger phase 3 study, and that is ongoing. This is called the PROCERA trial. And this would be the trial that, if successful, if positive, could lead to another new treatment for PH that's given by an inhaler. So those are the treatments that are closest to being available to us. I wanted to talk about some earlier phase stuff, things that I think are really smart, really exciting, but may or may not work out for us. There's this device that I heard about in January at a meeting called the ARIA device. So I'll show you part of the video. You can scan the QR code or go to the website if you want to watch the full thing. But this is actually an implantable device that has a little balloon. You can see right there. So it's implanted under the skin, and it kind of goes into the vein like how we do a right heart cath. And this little balloon sits in the pulmonary artery that connects the right side of the heart to the lungs. And it's sort of timed with every heartbeat to help improve the blood flow into the lung, take some of that stress off of the right ventricle, to sort of support it in patients who are maybe pretty advanced disease, who have a very dysfunctional right side of the heart. And this has been looked at now in a small group of people with PH, just to see, can you do this? Does it do what we think it does to pressure and blood flow in the lungs? And they saw some interesting positive responses, but this is an early phase study. The safety of this is unproven. We need to know, does this actually have enduring effects on people, and does it actually improve their function and outcomes? So hopefully we'll see some phase 2 and phase 3 studies of this device, which may be appropriate for some people. There's another intervention that's been looked at in several different types of pulmonary hypertension called pulmonary artery denervation. What does that mean? So this graphic shows the heart and the lungs. Like every other organ in your body, it receives nerves from the central nervous system that come from your brain, go around your spinal cord. These nerves control the tone of the blood vessels in the lung. What does that mean? The nervous system can control blood vessel constriction. It can also modulate dilation of the blood vessels and actually affect the pressure and flow in the lungs. And in PH, we know that this nervous system it's not working properly. It's overshooting nervous signals to the lungs. It's causing excessive constriction of the blood vessels. And this has bad effects on the right side of the heart. So what if you can interfere in that? We've looked at a couple of studies using medications to interfere in this nervous system problem. But with a catheter, you can actually zap these nerves. And we've done this in many other medical conditions. You can use a catheter that has a little ultrasound on the end of it, and you can apply high-frequency ultrasound waves that basically zap these nerves and stop them from sending these bad signals to the blood vessels in the lung. And they've done a fairly large trial. This was done in China, and there are some problems with the design of this study that make me worry that it doesn't directly apply to patients that we see. But it did seem to be pretty safe, and it did seem to improve things like the walk distance, the NT-proBNP, and fewer patients got worse compared to sildenafil. So really cool approach. Maybe it'll work out, maybe it won't, but the cool thing about this is it could be used in people with PAH, but also other types of PH where there is stress on the right side of the heart. So we'll see what happens. Stem cells, this is a really cool idea. There was a phase 2 trial called the Sapphire trial. Some people may have participated in this. Hopefully we'll have the results of this trial soon. But the concept here was to take your own stem cells that are circulating in your blood and then change them in the lab so that these cells produce more nitric oxide and then give them back to you. Nitric oxide is important for the health of blood vessels in the lung. People with PAH don't have enough nitric oxide. So we're kind of helping the cells in the lung produce this really important substance that improves the integrity and the function of the blood vessels in the lungs. So we take your own cells, we make them produce more nitric oxide, and then we give them back to you. And does that restore the function and improve things? So we'll find out. The Sapphire trial was a Canadian-led trial. Unfortunately, it was stopped early because of the COVID pandemic, but we should see some results hopefully soon. So most of what I've talked about is for PAH, but as you may know, there's a lot of other types of PH, and they're actually much more common in the population than PAH. So we call PAH group 1 pulmonary hypertension, but there's also group 2 and group 3, and we see a lot of these in our clinic. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of great treatments for people that have these conditions, although they suffer greatly from the pulmonary hypertension. So here's just a table showing that people care about these patients too. There are ongoing clinical trials aiming to look at potential treatments for group 2 PH. There's also a potential treatment for group 3 PH. I just want to say this is not approved in Canada, but there's an inhaled vasodilator called treprostinil. Some people may be on a subcutaneous version or an IV version of this drug in Canada, but the inhaled version is not approved here. This is for group 3 PH. So this is for people that have severe lung disease, which leads to high pressure in the lung. There's pictures here of a patient with what's called pulmonary fibrosis. This is scar tissue in the lung. This makes the lung very stiff, shrinks the size of the lung, but often the blood vessels are abnormal, they're thickened, and the pressure in the lung goes up. This can lead to right heart failure. And we don't have a lot of great treatments for people with this condition other than lung transplantation. This is an inhaled vasodilator, and in this phase 3 trial called the INCREASE trial, an inhaled vasodilator improved the 6-minute walking distance in people with this type of PH, and this is approved for use in the United States. There are several other ongoing trials looking at similar molecules as well as novel molecules in people with group 3 pulmonary hypertension. So hopefully we'll have some more results from these trials soon. I wanted to talk a little bit about something that's going on in Canada, aiming to sort of develop more broader treatments for the right side of the heart. So what happens to the right side of the heart in PH? This is from a slide from a previous talk given to PHA Canada, but in PH, the right side of the heart has to pump harder, and it gets thicker like any muscle over time. But if you leave that untreated, you can see that the right side of the heart starts to get bigger, it starts to dilate, and then it doesn't work quite as well. And when that happens, blood flow starts to leak backwards, it doesn't go forward into the lungs. You start to get high pressure on the right side of the heart that backs up into your legs. This is why people get swelling in their legs, they may get swelling in their stomach and in their liver. And so when the right side of the heart gets dysfunctional, our drugs don't work as well. We need to hospitalize people. People sometimes need to be in the intensive care unit, and they may need a lung transplantation. How do we treat right heart failure right now? Well, really it's at trying to remove fluid, address the underlying cause if we can. Sometimes we use types of life support that can help support the heart and the lungs temporarily while we decide whether or not someone can get a transplant. And ultimately, you can replace the abnormality, which is the lungs, with a lung transplant. So treating the underlying cause, sometimes people get sick from other things. They have a gastrointestinal bleed, they have an infection, they get pneumonia. We can use vasodilators, we can use diuretics or water pills to try to get that fluid off. We can use medications that can only be used in the intensive care unit that try to make your the heart pump harder. And then we can do things like ECMO and transplant. So we realize that this is a really big gap in care. We don't have really good treatments that affect dysfunction of the right side of the heart. So a bunch of people in this room, including Dr. Melnichuk and PHA Canada, have talked about this idea to develop a clinical trial that can test treatments efficiently for dysfunction of the right side of the heart. We call this CRAVE. This is the Canadian Right Ventricular Adaptive Trial. And we're about to start the first phase of this study. It's a phase 2 feasibility study, just to help us answer the question, can we actually pull something like this off in Canada and across the world? We're also working with an organization in the United States called PHA Aware to develop an app in this trial and sort of test whether or not we can measure the 6-minute walk distance at home instead of having to come in all the time to the research centers in a trial. Maybe we can measure some of the things that we do in a clinical trial outside of the center. That would be more convenient for patients, and maybe some people who live far away from their PH center may be then able to participate easier in a trial. This is early phases. This whole endeavor may or may not work out, but importantly, the whole idea comes from you. This is really driven from an exercise we did now back in 2022, where I'll tell a little anecdote. I was at a phase in my career where I wasn't really sure what to do with research. I'd gone to Europe. I spent a year in France doing really exciting research with an amazing group of people. And I got back and I was about to start my career here in Calgary, and I didn't really know what to focus on. And so I decided, why don't I just ask the people that are affected by this disease what's most important to them? And we worked with a big team across the country, including Dr. Melnichuk, Dr. Provencher, others, and PHA Canada was really integral in doing this. And we asked people, caregivers, patients, clinicians that deal with PH, what's most important to you? What questions should we try to answer with future research? And 2 of the top 10 had to do with the right side of the heart. Question number 4 were, what are the mechanisms of right heart adaptation to PH, and why do we develop right heart failure? So of course, understanding that could lead to new treatments that we could test in this CRAVE trial. Also, which interventions or treatments result in the best outcomes for patients with PH? Well, we know how important the right side of the heart is, so if we could improve the right side of the heart directly, we could likely improve outcomes for people. So here's where we're at. So I thank everybody who has participated in every stage of this process. We've been engaging with patients and with PHA Canada to try to design this trial properly so that it's meaningful to the people that it affects. But a clinical trial, as I said, is a very long process. It takes a lot of stuff to get something off the ground and running. So it started with an idea that came from all of you. That was in 2022. Lisa and I talked about this idea. We developed funding applications. It's hard to get money to do research these days, and so we had to get funding from multiple sources. We went back and forth with patients in PHA Canada, and we even got some money to run a meeting in Edmonton where we asked people, how should we design this trial? So patients came from all over the country. Other experts came from other countries to try to design this trial properly. But then you have to develop a protocol. You have to get that protocol approved by Health Canada, because we're looking at medications that aren't approved for right heart failure. You have to get ethics boards of the universities where you're running the trial to approve it. You have to get contracts between the institutions to share money and share data. And then you have to try to recruit people to the trial. Then you have to analyze the trial. Then you can publish your results, and then you can go on to the next step. So this process may take still another year or 2, but we're very, very grateful for all of the organizations that have contributed funds, time, resources, including the very precious time of our patient partners who have given us these ideas and helped us design this study. So in summary, clinical trials are the only way we can determine whether or not a new treatment works in any disease, but also PH, and they need to be They need to be developed and executed rigorously. That's the only way we can know that something works and that it's safe. There are recent and ongoing PH trials that are aiming to improve upon our existing treatments, either to make them work better or minimize side effects. But there are a lot of new treatments aiming to reverse aspects of the disease, to reverse that remodeling, to target the abnormal function of the right side of the heart and to support it when people get sick. There's also treatments that target the abnormal nervous system, that use stem cells. There's a lot of really exciting approaches coming down the pipeline. And so I just want to end by thanking everybody, past and present, who's participated in clinical trials. The people that go into them don't always benefit from them. You don't know if you're going to get the placebo. You don't know if you're going to get the real treatment. Not everyone makes it, but every treatment we have today is because people had the courage to participate in a clinical trial. Some of those people are no longer with us, but everything that we know is thanks to them. And so I will acknowledge that clinical trials aren't for everyone, and that's okay. There's other ways that people can participate in research, but those people that do participate, I think we owe them a very large debt of gratitude. And for everyone in the future, if you want to know more about how this process works, there's lots of resources, and we are all happy to talk about it. Thank you very much.
I'm a little shorter. So this is the point in the plenary where we ask for questions from the audience. I don't know if we have a microphone for anybody who's going to, I really don't expect people to yell from the back, the audience, but do we have a microphone? Yeah, so we'll start with some questions. I thought maybe to sort of ease our way in, I might ask start off with a question, and anybody who wants to answer, feel free. Can you speak to the importance of genetic testing in PAH patients, specifically as it relates to the genes implicated in the rarer forms of PAH, the finding of the genes that are responsible for PVOD? And also, why genetic testing is so important in terms of getting, the phrase that we use is getting the right medicine to the right patient at the right time. I'm going to ask tough questions. You guys get the easy ones.
Can you hear me? Okay. So the first part about that question, how important are genetics? The short answer is they're very important. Genetics is complicated. I'm not a geneticist, but just because someone has a gene doesn't mean they'll get a disease. Just because someone has the disease doesn't mean it's genetic. And so it's really complex, but there are some genes that we know definitely cause PAH. There's a gene that you mentioned that causes PVOD, and if you have it, you almost certainly will get PVOD. So far, we don't have ways to effectively correct that genetic problem, but there's a lot of research going on into gene editing, fixing the problems with the protein that a gene encodes. And so that may be important in developing new therapies for people with a specific gene. There's other ways we can use genetics in clinical trials in the future because, as you say, you want to predict who's going to respond to a drug. You can also predict who may not respond to a drug and who may have side effects. And part of that may be related to genetics. And this is where new technologies like AI may help us because we can look at thousands of genes to try to look at people who were in a clinical trial and who responded to a drug, who didn't. Maybe some of the genes that they have are associated with getting better. That way we can run clinical trials in the future more efficiently because maybe you'll say, well, only people with this gene can get into the clinical trial because we know it's probably going to work in them. You could do a clinical trial much quicker. You can answer the question with fewer people, less money, less time. And so then we can get more treatments into people sooner and use them in the right person. Genes also have some important clinical value in terms of predicting a prognosis. But it's a really complicated thing to test for genes because there's implications for the patient, there's implications for their family, and it can cause a lot of anxiety. So we need to talk about genetics and understand those things before we even do the test, not after you do the test. So those are my thoughts on genes.
Thank you.
I think Jason has said all the really important things. I think that the last part of it is just, what I would reemphasize. There is no absolute necessity to have genetic testing for the reasons that Jason has outlined. At this point, I think there's a lot we can learn from genetic testing, and there are some people who may be very in favor of it, and yet there may be other people out there who feel very anxious about it. What does this mean? Because as Jason has said, there's not certainty if you carry a gene or if that your family member carries the gene that they will get the disease. And that can create a substantial amount of uncertainty and anxiety. So the right answer is what feels right to you at that time. And it's not a one-way street. Perhaps right now that may or may not interest you. Maybe a year from now or 2 years from now, you might feel differently as your life changes or other things become apparent about what we know about the relationship between genetics and pulmonary hypertension. These are good conversations to have with your clinician. Almost every center in Canada, or perhaps I would argue every center in Canada, has access or should have access to a genetic clinic. And that can be some shared decision making where you can go and you can talk to your healthcare provider about, someone said something about genetic testing. Is this right for me? Should I get it? Should I not get it? And as Jason says, I think all of us that work in PH clinics in Canada, now I don't know that anyone has a special expertise as a genetic counselor, but there are people that we can help to get you involved in where you can have those conversations about, understanding what this means for you and whether it's the right thing or not.
Maybe just to also add to the last part of Joan's question, clearly we know if we take 100 patients with pulmonary hypertension, not every drug's going to work in all of you. But right now, we don't actually know which drug might work better or not. This is Joan's question. If I knew more about your genetics, could I pick the right drug that is more likely to work? Absolutely. But sadly, Joan, we don't have that information yet, but it is a big area of focus. It's called pharmacogenomics, addressing the drug to your genetics. The other interesting thing is about testing. And one of the greatest things about being a physician in an area of medicine that's growing is learning every day. So last 2 days, you heard about the medical think tank and fantastic presentations, our colleagues, mostly Canadian, and great work going on. And so we're not sitting there saying, yeah, I know all this. We're learning. So I learned something new the last 2 days, many things. One was that I probably have not been doing enough genetic testing. And so I'm going to change that. For my patients who are here, a couple of you, it seems really important looking in people of certain types of PH. If you're younger, under 50, you likely have a genetic mutation. And if we find that, obviously your family's at risk. We can talk, as Lisa said, about genetic counseling, but also it seems to be that the medications may not work as well if you're younger and have genetic disease. We might need to think about transplants sooner, which nobody wants to do if you're doing well on medications, but really helpful to know this person might not do as well. So things are changing, and so clearly when I go back home Monday, I'm going to start thinking about doing more genetic testing.
Thank you, guys. Any questions from the audience?
Hi there. I'm just wondering, I've always asked this question. If you get a lung transplant, what's not to guarantee you won't get pulmonary hypertension in the new set of lungs if it's genetic?
A great question. So it can happen, but it's really, really rare. And it depends probably on the type of pulmonary hypertension. In general, when you get a transplant, the DNA in that lung is not you. So those lungs don't have the gene. The cells in that lung does not have the gene. It's been reported in types of pulmonary veno-occlusive disease that it can recur, but it's still really, really rare. In people who have an underlying condition that led to their pulmonary hypertension, maybe like lupus or connective tissue diseases like scleroderma, that disease doesn't go away with a transplant. Now, we give really powerful immune-suppressing drugs, which also treat the lupus and the scleroderma, but it can still reoccur, but it's really uncommon. And hopefully it buys people, if it does happen, it delays that process by years. So that's a great question.
Other questions?
I'm just wondering, when will the Soteratap be available to those of us who have the PAH? Is it something we can ask for, or join a trial or something like that?
It's a great question, and I think everybody wants to know the answer to that question. Right now, there is, as Jason said earlier, the drug has been approved for use in patients with pulmonary arterial hypertension. There are probably other trials that may be done with sotatercept in the future in different disease states or in different stages of the disease, and some of those are ongoing. So certainly from a clinical trial perspective, there may be opportunity in the future to participate in future trials of sotatercept, depending on what those trials are. But the real question is, when can I have the drug in clinic? And that, as Jason outlined, that process is ongoing now in discussion. I don't think it's going to be very long, but it's going to depend a little bit on that reimbursement issue. Are you able to get the drug through private health insurance? Are you able to get the drug, or do you need to depend on the public health formulary to get the drug? And every province works a little bit differently. Some provinces are really quick with this. Other provinces are a little bit slower. I don't have a date that I can give you, but people are working really, really hard. And one of the things that I think is really nice about the field is that we work very closely with our industry partners. And so Merck is the partner that has been, we've been working with them for 2 years before the drug has been on scene. And we are avidly working with them and advocating to get the drug to our patients as fast as possible, either through compassionate release or through helping to do whatever we can to expedite the approval process and the pricing process so we can have the drug. Would I like to see it in the hands of every eligible patient before the end of the calendar year? I absolutely would. But there are many steps that we still have to go to get there. But I hope that at least getting drug into clinic, particularly for people who can get access quickly, either through private insurance or through compassionate release, I would hope that we're looking at, small numbers of months, not many numbers of months.
Are you still looking for people to do trials?
It depends where you live. There are 2 ongoing phase 3 trials, one of which is looking at people relatively recently diagnosed, I think within the last year. And then there's another trial called Zenith that's looking at people with really severe PH in functional class 3 and 4 that are what we call high risk. So that trial is still ongoing, but it's not running at every university. So some universities are participating in different trials. The last thing I'll just make a pitch to you all and acknowledge PHA Canada for is that even getting to the point where we're at now with the process of not just drug approval, but this Canada's Drug Agency recommendation, PHA has been at the table. They've submitted documents to advocate to get access to this drug. And you all have some power to change the future of this. You can write to the politicians, you can write to the people in your communities that make these decisions to advocate for that, and you can make a difference. I've got a patient who has literally made a difference in how patients get access to oxygen in Alberta because the criteria were silly for people with PAH, and you can make a change. And I'd written 50 letters in my career to try to get people oxygen, and they often got refused, and it was just one brave person who wrote to a letter and told their story that was able to change that process. So you can make a difference and help whatever happens in the future with access to sotatercept in your region. You can probably collectively and individually influence that.
Yeah, can I just speak on behalf of PHA Canada? We will be, as an organization, developing an advocacy plan for all of the provinces in order for our patients to advocate on your individual behalfs and on the collective behalf of all of the patients across this country for access to the medicine, what it's called Winrevair, to Winrevair as soon as possible. And like Jason said, it really does. It becomes the access part becomes a provincial responsibility, and so it's really incumbent on all of us because some provinces will get it sooner than others, and so we're going to try as an organization to get as many patients across Canada to advocate to their MPPs and their MLAs as possible, so that we can get access to as many patients across Canada. One of the things we really fight for is equal and equitable access across this country. And the system that we live in does not really allow that to happen because the provinces make the decisions on their own. But the reality of it is, as Jason mentioned, patient stories at this stage of the process really do make a difference. And so we will be looking to all of you to help us get this drug across the finish line so patients can get access to it as quickly as possible.
But you are saying this is not a cure.
It's not a cure.
That's actually a really point. We know it has tremendous benefits in the study, but several hundred patients. That's it. That's tiny. And we're so excited that it's been approved in Canada and approved in the US in April. It's already being used. So we're going to learn a lot over the first few months when it's not hundreds, but thousands of patients are going to be on it. And to share some excitement, the first patient got special authorization. Is Joan Gibson here? Everybody knows Joan, one of our ambassadors. And so Joan's daughter, Jane, got special access approval and got her first injection last week, I heard. So that's very exciting for us to get. So other than the trials, to us start seeing exposure in Canada. Now, to sound a cautionary note, it's not going to work for everybody. Jason pointed out very nicely, 20% risk of bleeding and funny new blood vessels. So there could be some people that are at risk for more of those. So that's going to take a lot more experience and exposure for us to figure out.
And you talk about the bleeding part. I'm a patient that's also on warfarin. Will that be a factor?
Almost certainly, yes. So we know other medications like imatinib, which we were quite excited about 20 years ago, led to bleeding, like serious bleeding in the brain in roughly a third. So we're not doing that with imatinib anymore, but this one also leads to bleeding, and it seems to be higher risk if you're on a blood thinner. So almost certainly we're going to be more careful in somebody like you. If it's safe, stop the blood thinner first. If it's not safe, if you have no other options, maybe try the sotatercept, but monitor you very, very carefully. So lots of questions still.
I've never had problems with blood clots before, but I had a right heart cath, and it caused a blood clot in my heart.
Oh.
So I've been on blood thinners for 4 years now. My concern is, if I didn't have the problem before, am I still really high risk for blood clots, even though it was caused by that procedure?
It's a great question. I think that's a really good question for your doctors and also maybe a hematologist to assess you and your blood.
Thank you. Any other questions? Beth?
Do you know the mechanism of why sotatercept causes bleeding or could cause bleeding?
Wow, we don't, but it's a great question. But we have some ideas. And again, the last 2 days, the think tank, wonderful data on this. So to step back a little bit, we've talked about genetic causes of PH. One of them that's associated is something called hereditary hemorrhagic telangiectasia, HHT. And there's clearly a gene defect that causes that. And many of those patients also get pulmonary arterial hypertension. And so what seems to be possible is in changing the biology as Jason showed, turning off one pathway which causes cells to grow, turning on the other pathway which tells cells to behave themselves, we actually might be turning on something like HHT in some patients. So it's a little scary. HHT is not a good disease, bleeding from the nose, bleeding in the bowels, in the brain, in the lungs. And so we definitely don't want to do that. So this might be an example where we do the genetics and say, oh, you have the gene for HHT, even though you don't have the disease, maybe you shouldn't get sotatercept. So lots of great research going on, which was the great thing about the last 2 days, but definitely risks more in some people than others.
Thank you.
I have two questions. One is for me and one is for Tarja, who's up in the room. So Tarja was wondering if there are other similar drugs in the pipeline that work like sotatercept, but don't potentially have that bleeding issue. And I guess I was wondering for caregivers and other people, when you're talking about advocacy to talk to our provincial ministries or organizations like that, what are we asking them? Or are there sort of like ways that we can ask that would help better?
For the last part, Joan is the best person to ask for things. She's done it for many years. Maybe you should tackle that, Joan.
I will. Do you want to answer the first part of the question?
Jason, do you want to talk about the other versions of sotatercept?
So I'll answer the first question. So there is another drug that's actually made by a Canadian-based company from Montreal. The drug's called, I think, HS135, and they've just started a early phase study looking at this drug, which, at least in animal studies, maybe doesn't have some of those off-target side effects. We don't know. It hasn't been looked at. It's just about to start being looked at in people with PAH. I don't even think we're participating in that trial, but we haven't, no patients have gone into it yet. So there is another similar drug that maybe will have less side effects, maybe not. But of course, now that that pathway, we've shown that you can target this pathway and it works, that's what the future will hold. And that's what happened with the other PH drugs, is trying to refine them, trying to make them better and safer. But hopefully they'll work just as well. But we need to test that. It's a completely different drug. Just because it says it does the same thing doesn't mean it actually does. So we need to test everything rigorously. And then second part of the question.
In terms of the second part of your question, as I had said before, I think like PHA Canada is working on an advocacy campaign for all of the provinces across Canada, which will, specifically give you the ideas, the strategies to use when you visit your MLA or your MPP. What I can say is that part of that strategy will always be telling your story. It's important for decision makers to understand the daily lived experiences of patients, because what they see in the submissions that go to Health Canada and the CDA are just, we do patient submissions and we do clinical submissions, but that information is aggregated. And so it's numbers, it's totals, it's percentages. It's not your individual stories. And individual stories are really the things that make the difference when it comes to deciding if a drug, not necessarily if the drug is going to be approved, but it really does, it can turn the tide. I have a question in the back.
Sorry, Joan, just going to add something to that. Let's understand our economy in Canada. Let's say the drug is $50,000 a year, give or take, and easily 1,000 people in Canada could benefit from it. That's $50 million. We don't have that money. And yet, we want to push provincial ministries of health to say, find that money. And so they have their bosses and the finance minister saying, you cannot spend more money. And yet, they're all human. Each person that we talk to from PHA Canada or we go talk to Ministry of Health, they're human. So they hear the stories of people dealing with this illness, not doing well, having side effects of other medications. Those little things make such a major impact. It's a competition, sadly, between our illness and other illnesses and other competing demands, but it makes all the world of difference what you have to say and contribute.
So I just want to go back to something that Lisa was saying about funding, and perhaps those of us that are fortunate to have private insurance. Obviously, that's a process in and of itself, and historically, it's only a percentage that they will cover as well. I'm from Ontario, so I can't speak to the Canadian experience, but I'd assume it's pretty standard, quote unquote, across the provinces. So in my experience, what my private insurance doesn't pay then goes to the Trillium drug program, and they, minus a deductible, they kind of cover that gap. What does that look like in terms of, I'll say, quote unquote, perhaps earlier access for those of us with private insurance, still knowing there's that piece that's a question mark?
It's a great question, and I don't know that we know exactly what it's going to look like, because we still don't know exactly how much the drug is going to cost. But you are exactly right. That's typically the process for most people. And if you are fortunate enough to have private insurance, then typically the private insurance companies will have access or list the drug very quickly, right? Because they want to do the best that they can generally. And then that amount that patients have to pay, that difference, if the insurance company can cover anywhere from 50 to 100% of the cost, cost, there is, for many people, still a delta that needs to be paid that's outside of the private insurance. And as you say, that can either come from patients' own pockets, or it can come from reimbursement of third parties like Trillium, or in some cases it can come from support from the company itself. And they do, and historically for pulmonary hypertension, that has been, a very helpful avenue for our patients. Usually that's limited help until the provinces pick it up. And as you've already heard a few times, unfortunately, different provinces work at different paces, right? So sometimes that support is very short, and for other times that support needs to be longer. And again, in the concept of advocacy, having lived and practiced in Ontario for many, many, many years, it is so critical at that point that each province gets involved with trying to get their ministry to understand why we want this drug on the table. And that has made a huge difference over the history of PAH clinical trials, from us being only able to use one therapy, fighting for 2 therapies, fighting for 3 therapies, fighting for different types of therapies, with working with PHA Canada, working with our patient partners in each province. It's made a huge difference in Ontario, and I suspect other places as well. But I don't have an answer yet as to how much that gap is going to be. These are questions I think that will fold out in the next couple of months as we understand more about the pricing.
Sonia, did you still have a question? Hang on. Sorry, Sonia was first. I saw your hand earlier.
That's okay. That's fine. I'm just wondering, is there, are there any drugs out there now? Sorry, I have a raspy, I had bad sleep. Out there right now that will attack in any other pathway than what's being trialed right now, whether it's over in Europe or China or anywhere else, that you kind of have some hope for or have knowledge about?
I mean, I've got hope for all of them. Like, you never really know. I mean, the sad fact of the matter, and I don't know the exact stat, but for the industry people in the room, it's like 1 in 10 drugs actually makes it to market. So for every 1 they get approved, 10 fail for a variety of reasons. It just trial wasn't designed properly, bad side effects. Maybe it works, but like imatinib actually seemed to work. It just had really bad side effects. So, companies have tried to take those and refine them. And there was a company that had made an inhaled version of imatinib, and maybe that was really promising because we knew biologically this treatment works. But if you could develop a way to minimize the side effects, maybe you could improve it. But unfortunately, the trial didn't work. Like, they did a phase 2 trial, it didn't do anything. So we just don't know that until we look. What I'm excited about is the fact that people care and people are looking at a lot of different things. And I showed that really busy biology slide, but there's even treatments out there that are already approved for other indications, that for other diseases that might actually work in PAH through a variety of biological processes. And I'll give you an example of one that is kind of interesting, and it may or may not work out, but some people at Stanford were looking at a pretty cheap drug that we actually use as an immune suppressant called tacrolimus. It's used after a lung transplant to prevent rejection, but it turns out in some of their early studies, if you give really low doses of this, it actually affects the BMPR2 pathway, the mutation that leads to some forms of genetic PH, and it improves the way that sort of protein works. And so it's a cheap, widely available drug, relatively cheap, that has generics. And so maybe it'll work out, maybe it doesn't, but people are looking at all sorts of cool ideas that may lead to new treatments, and we just don't know until we try. That's why trials are critical. Like, we just don't learn unless we do clinical trials that are rigorous, large enough, and we can get enough people that want to participate in it.
Just to add a couple of things, Sonia. So this takes time. So Tadalafil, we're all excited, Health Canada approval, but the patent first actually launched 2015, 9 years. So all the new stuff that Jason's told us about, it's going to take several years. The other thing is just a cautionary note. We get excited about something, and there's lots of issues logistically. So our friends in Quebec City, Steve Provencher and Sébastien Bonnet, fantastic research. They, in their basic science work in cells and animals, have found 2 interesting drugs that actually could help PH, and they're trying to do their own clinical trials. It has been so difficult in the absence of pharma involvement. The company that makes one of those drugs, apabetalone, actually stopped making it because they didn't think this was a large enough problem. So it's really, really difficult. If you had to ask me, Jason and I are lung specialists. We believe the lungs inhale things and absorb things so well. I'm really excited about inhaled therapies. And so the one that you mentioned, seralutinib, I think is really interesting and exciting, what it targets biologically, but also the idea of inhaling it in. And the phase 2 study was very positive, and the phase 3 study out. So that's my kind of next expectation.
I just have one comment regarding advocacy. We are looking at it from patient and medical viewpoints, but if we look at it from the funding agency, they want dollars and cents makes sense to them. You take a child with PH, look at the cost of the medication versus a lifetime of productivity. You look at somebody in the productive years of life with PH, how much would the system save if this person was adequately treated and could be productive? You know, for one thing, number one, self-sufficient, like take care of their own needs and benefit the rest of the world.
Can I answer that question?
Absolutely.
This is my wheelhouse. The reality of it is, I mean, the problem with our system, and it's every system across globally, that when they look at approving drugs, they're looking at approving them on a cost-effective, what they call a cost-effective basis. And that cost-effective basis basically is, you know, how much is it costing us, not so much how much it's benefiting the patient. I mean, that's part of the conversation, but it's all, but the additional part of that conversation is the other things. How is it benefiting the caregiver? How is it benefiting the family? How is it benefiting society? Can this person go back to work? Can this person, you know, get their children to school in the morning? Those kinds of questions, there's no dollar attached to those, but they are very important from a patient perspective, which is again the reason why we need patients to talk about their lived experience with the people who make these decisions, because it's those things that they don't cost in their cost effectiveness analysis. And so, yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, I fully agree with you, and I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth when you go to start advocating for this, but does anyone know what a lung transplant costs the system in the room? I mean, even just the surgery, it's probably like $200,000 or $300,000. And so, you know, when you're thinking about what you want to write to advocate for yourself, do a bit of research. I mean, find out what it costs in Toronto, find out what it costs in Alberta, but just, you know, build that dollars and cents into your personal story. Like, we can provide data, we can provide numbers, but if you put those numbers into your story, it's meaningful. If you tell someone, you know, if I could get 40% better with a new treatment, I could keep working, or I could go from part-time to full-time, I could delay a lung transplant by 5 years and still work. How much tax revenue is that for your province, blah, blah, blah. Like, you know, you can build that into your stories, but you have to maybe do a bit of research and find out what those numbers are. I don't know what they are, but something to consider for the future.
Okay, maybe the last question?
One question? Yeah.
This probably elaborates a little bit on that previous question, but what advice do you guys have for, you know, those of us who do want to express these letters to our politicians from provinces where we're maybe feeling a little bit discouraged by previous decisions? You know, when we've had people like Jazz, you know, advocating for us for like 20 years, and I still have to mix my own IV meds or one of my drugs that is approved in every single other province but BC. You know, for people like us who are kind of feeling like we're already starting from a rare standpoint and now we're kind of facing rejection as it is, what advice would you give for those who kind of want to jump in?
I'll answer that question again. The reality of it is we can only do the individual individual patient stories are really, really important. But I think that the reason what PHA Canada is trying to do is to engage patients across the country to understand that this is the reality. Like, there are some provinces in this country that get access to medicines much sooner than other provinces, and so it gets back to the whole equal and equitable access to drugs. And I think if more patients in this country understood that we still have provinces in this country where they don't have access to the drugs that we might have in Ontario. I mean, when people begin to realize that the reality of it is that some of us are better off than other patients in this country, that we will also we advocate on behalf of all of the patients in this country to try and improve access for everyone.
And maybe I'll just add to that. We are stronger in numbers, without a doubt, and I think the commitment from PHA Canada has been overwhelming, and I'm so excited with what is coming, with the goals and the priorities around advocacy, and just to kind of give you a sense of some of the success we've had. So Tadorcept got an expedited review through Health Canada because I think largely in part through PHA Canada and the letters that were written and the stories that were told about how important it is to review this quickly so that we can move the needle forward for our patients. And that's just one example of, I think, many of the ways that we can work together. And PHA Canada also, there are other places to go to work together. So we as individuals are stronger when we group together, and PHA Canada is stronger, I think, because we work with other organizations as well. So, for example, the Canadian Thoracic Society, the Canadian Cardiovascular Society, these are other organizations that many of us are involved with, and I think we all need to be working together on the same page, getting that message out there for these patients and for our families, regardless. So those are some of the steps that I think that we're going to take to really help to push this forward and get the right drug to the patients at the right time.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that for patient partners. Lisa's talking about the clinician organizations. There is an organization in Canada called the Canadian Organization of Rare Disorders that actually works on behalf of all of the rare diseases in Canada to try and get earlier access to, amongst other things. We talk about a national strategy for drugs for rare disease. As an organization, we would love to have a national strategy that just talks about rare disease, not just the drugs. We need to have a strategy that encompasses diagnostics, the whole process, access, not only the funding for research, funding for registries, funding for clinical trials, all of those things. And a drug strategy might get some of the rare disease organizations access to their drugs earlier, but it isn't going to solve the problem of access to drugs for all of the rare disease organizations unless we have a full-blown strategy. And unfortunately, I have to close the session on that note, but I'd like to take the opportunity to thank the panelists for being with us to open the conference with this amazing session. If you're interested in learning more about how some of our patients have already participated at the bench stage of the process, Jason and Lisa will be discussing more of their CRAVE trial in one of the next breakout sessions at 10:45, following a short now 13-minute break. If your interest leads you somewhere else to one of the other sessions, I think the idea that I hope you take away with you today is that patient engagement is critical at all stages of the bench to bedside spectrum. Your role is not limited to being the person at the bedside. You have so much more to offer. It is your data that advances our knowledge and understanding of how the disease develops and progresses. It is your data generated through clinical trials that determines if a new treatment is doing what it was designed to do. But most of all, you are the person who understands how your disease is impacting your life and the lives of the people around you. Our researchers and clinicians want and need to know what is important to you on your disease journey. So thank you very much, all of you, for joining us this morning, and have a great conference.